Hello, everyone. Welcome to our next session, session 1 AV. This is Find the Grants and Endeavor to Write with Shelby Beatty, Archivist and Records Manager at Sinclair Community College, as well as Secretary for the Society of Ohio Archivists. So Shelby Beatty is the Archivist and Records Manager at Sinclair Community College in Dayton, Ohio. She graduated from Wright State University with her bachelor's in social science education in 2014 and master's in public history with a concentration in archival administration in 2016. Prior to coming to Sinclair in February 2020, she worked as a reference archivist at the Ohio History Connection. Shelby currently serves as the secretary for the Society of Ohio Archivists. Originally from Fairborn, Ohio, Shelby currently resides in Dayton with her husband, Mark, and children, Vanessa and Russell. So welcome, Shelby, and I'll let you take it away. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending today's annual meeting and my session on Find the Grants and Endeavor to Write. Megan said, my name is Shelby Beatty, the Archivist and Records Manager at Sinclair in Dayton, Ohio. And before I get started, I want to do just a brief story of how I got introduced to grants at all, because I think like many of us, we come into the profession with no really idea or frame of reference on how to even write a grant. We know that overwhelmingly our field is underfunded. And we know that we're going to have to seek out funds, but we don't really know how, where to start, all of that. And when I was in grad school, we have every year an annual symposium that the students would put on to showcase final projects, capstones, important work that we did in school. And my first year, we decided, let's, write a grant to get more food and swag for the guests. So we were like, okay, yeah, we'll just write a grant. Like it was something that was going to be really easy. And luckily the director of the program at the time, Dawn Dewey, for anybody that's familiar with Wright State's public history program, she very much so encouraged it. She's like, this is a great opportunity. You're going to get some grant writing experience before you even graduate from college. Because, almost definitely you're going to have to go through this at some point in your career. So might as well get started now. And so we just whipped up a narrative, let her handle the budget since she, had the connections with the college and the grants administration there. And she reviewed our narrative and provided constructive criticism, but ultimately left it up to the students. And we applied for an Ohio Humanities grant, one of their smaller grants, just to get a little bit of extra money. And we were so excited. We thought we were the best writers, and it totally flopped. It was really, really bad. We got a lot of constructive criticism though. And, you could get down on yourself. You could say, I'm never going to do this again. But with the encouragement from Dawn and Ohio Humanities, especially, the next time around, they're like, why don't you submit a draft to us so we could tell you what's wrong with it before you apply. So next time, there's actually a chance for money. So we went with the bare minimum for that year's symposium. It went off fine. It was great. We didn't have as much food, no big deal. But the next year we had an outline from where to start. And we were, determined to go back to Ohio Humanities. We're like, we're going to do it this time. We're not going to go to another granting organization. We're going to get it this time. And we worked so hard. And, through all of that, even though we could have just sat back and said, we didn't get it last year, we're not going to try again. We used kind of the bones of our first draft, our first grant opportunity, made it better through research and more focus and, some of the critiques that Ohio Humanities gave us. And we were able to get the grant for the next symposium. So I think starting off with a failure for me was really actually encouraging, because in grant writing, there might be, a few failures before you finally get the money, but it's so rewarding to finally get what you sought out to do. And it truly is a skill that you have to kind of master by doing. So I hope today to kind of covered that, really the endeavor to continue to move forward in your grant seeking, grant writing, and to continue to hone that craft throughout your profession, because it's such a needed skill set in the archive field. So a little bit about Sinclair Community College, where I work. We're 138 years old. We were founded in 1887 by David Sinclair. He was the general secretary of the Dayton YMCA. We were part of the Dayton YMCA until we received separate incorporation in 1959. Eventually, it became a public college in 1965. And the college motto, still to this day, is find the need and endeavor to meet it, hence where the title of my presentation comes from. Dayton, when he started at the YMCA, was beginning to really industrialize, and people were getting left behind because they didn't have the skill set, the education to adapt to the changing workforce in Dayton. And employers, they wanted to hire people, but people didn't have the skills needed to match the industrial setting that was booming in Dayton. So he sought out to figure out, what do employers need? What skills do the community need to get these jobs? And how are we as a college going to help bridge the gap? So we have over 300 degree programs. In 2022-23, we had over 30,000 students attending Sinclair and nearly 10,000 degrees and certificates awarded that year. 2,500 employees. We have 3 campuses in Southwest Ohio, and one of me. I am a department of one, which I think many people are probably nodding their heads, because that is really how it goes. Not only that, and I'm not just going to complain this entire time, I promise, but I am the archivist and records manager within the library, which is pretty normal for our profession at an institution of higher education, under academic affairs, the provost office, which their focus, as it should be at a college, is student success. So I'm pretty low on that totem pole as far as where funds get distributed. So grants are essential to really building a robust archival program at my institution. I want to note here, due to current federal funding cuts, it's really, really important to, before you set out to seek grant funding, really think about and look into what's actually being offered right now. It's such a weird time in grant funding and grant seeking that we have to be hyper aware of what's actually available, and what is slowly getting kind of chipped away at currently. Maybe I am just too optimistic, or I'm very glass half full type person. I fully believe these grants are going to be made available again, IMLS and NEH and all of that. So I think it's important that you continue to compose grants. It could be with the requirements for an IMLS grant that you were seeking before funding got cut. And you just work to continue revising, reviewing, and building that grant opportunity up. Maybe you end up applying for something else because you need the funds sooner than later. But I encourage you not to quit and not to let this weird time kind of make you lose hope in getting the funding. There are a lot of opportunities out there still. And again, maybe I'm too optimistic, but I feel like these institutions will one day be funded again and have plenty of grant funds to help you with your projects. Now, if you attended virtual sessions yesterday, you're probably already familiar with a lot of these granting organizations in Ohio. It was kind of a master class yesterday of grant reviewers and people involved in these granting organizations, which I thought was just so wonderful. So I don't want to rehash what they discussed. But there's a lot of opportunity just within the state of Ohio, and they offer really approachable grants with very detailed outlines that are very specific. There's not a lot of gray wording that would make you question, like, what exactly do they want from me? It's very cut and dry. So I've worked on Ohio Humanities grants before. They have multiple different options. And then many of these grants are annually and at different times of the year. So if you were to not get funding for, let's say, the Ohio Local History Alliance, which is due in February, maybe there is an opportunity that would relate or kind of closely align with requirements for the Ohio Historical Records Advisory Board grant, which is a little bit later, and the Ohio History Fund is even later in the year. So kind of be thinking about it that way, that there's all of these accessible grants here in Ohio to help you get started on your grant writing endeavors. So grants, since I've been at Sinclair, I've worked under a lot of grants in my time in the field. At Sinclair specifically, I've applied and been awarded 3 grants. So this presentation overall is kind of just a case study in my experience as somebody I can still consider myself as a novice in grant writing and fulfilling grant requirements. My first grant was in 2021, about a year after I was hired with the Ohio Local History Alliance. It was a digitization grant to get Sinclair onto Ohio Memory. If you remember from a presentation yesterday, a representative from the Local History Alliance discussed, you can get a grant to get your materials digitized, and whether you're doing it in-house or contracting that out. I had the Ohio History Connection digitize everything for me and put it directly onto Ohio Memory, a statewide digital library program here in Ohio. I don't have any type of digital repository in my institution, and there have been no large-scale digitization efforts since I started, or before I started. So 130 some years of history just sitting in an archive, which it happens. That's, that's the way it usually goes. And so I knew, having been at the Ohio History Connection, the capabilities of the digital services team. So being able to get a grant to outsource that until I can get funding later to actually get some equipment in-house to do the digitization. And then they also are going to get me set up with an ohiomemory.org page so I can showcase and make accessible what we've digitized. And then in 2022, I went for my first ORAB grant to purchase an overhead scanner. It's a small but mighty little scanner, and fund processing projects while digitizing content. This is really where students came in, which I'll discuss later. Since I'm an office of one, being able to hire students to really help not only make collections more accessible, but also help them learn more about the profession and enhance some of their soft skills for those students that do not necessarily want to become archivists. I was able to contribute to student success at my institution. And then most recently, we were awarded a grant from ORAB for a large format scanning station. Includes a camera stand, lighting, and a backdrop. And actually, a student of mine wrote this grant. And it was such a pleasure to oversee the development of her first grant. She was able to do this before she graduated from grad school, which just happened a couple weeks ago now, or last week now, and have that experience to be able to put on her resume. So first I want to discuss, when it comes to starting a grant, really reading through the grant requirements as many times as possible. It's wild when and I'm sure you've experienced this in other ways, when you read something just one time and you look back through it, you're like, oh, I totally missed that. A lot of the RFPs for grants are really long because they want you to include a lot of very specific information. So reading as many times as you can, and starting really early on this, reading the proposal or the guidelines from last year. Start there, and then when they release the ones for this year, read that over because there might be some changes. But reading and highlighting and understanding the RFP is critical to getting started in your grant writing experience. Are you eligible? Do you actually have the time to not only write the grant, to get the narrative put together, to get the budget put together, but actually fulfill grant requirements? How long is the grant period? These are things you really want to consider before you even get started on writing. Really customize to the requirements. I like to think of grant writing as you're applying for a job. Your proposal is your resume. It is highly specific to the grant. And I like to have, a list of potential grant projects that I save, just to kind of go back to when grant opportunities come up. I might have a standard statement about the history of my institution, where collections are housed, things like that that you can use throughout different granting opportunities, but really focusing on each grant as a totally separate opportunity. Just like if you were applying for a new job or you're applying for multiple jobs at once, you probably are going to customize your resume at least a little bit each time to make sure you're meeting the minimum requirements for that job. Things I've missed in the past, that you must be an OLA member to apply for their digitization grant. Like if you submit, and luckily I missed this before submitting it, that would have, I would have felt really silly, like, oh, I need to be a member, duh. But yeah, that's reading not only the requirements, but I mean, they have this just posted in bold letters on their website. So it's really reading through everything. And then I was able to make sure that we were members before we applied for the grant. For the ORAB re-grant, currently it cannot be used for newspaper digitization because NHRPC does not allow that. In the past, they have allowed that. So if you're using a really old version of the guidelines, even just, I think, 5-ish years ago, newspapers were able to be digitized as part of the grant. You might run into issues there. My student that wrote this most recent ORAB grant really wanted to get a grant to digitize student newspapers that are oversized and we need special scanning equipment to do so. And I was like, oh, that's a wonderful idea. And then I start looking through the RFP. I'm like, oh, this, we were looking at ORAB requirements that were dated, it just kind of to prepare for release of the new ones. And we realized, wow, we can't even do this. So I reached out to ORAB reviewers for the grant. And they're like, oh no, you don't write a grant for that because we can't accept it. So I think there's, of course, power in reading through it, but also connecting with granting organizations. Like, it says not newspapers. Does that include student newspapers? Are you talking about published, nationally available newspapers, to get that clarification? But yeah, there's little things that you can certainly miss if you don't read it over like crazy. Write the basic proposal and narrative before reaching out to a grants development. I'm not sure, at every organization how grants are developed and permitted. At my institution, we have grants development, which they assist all departments in getting grant packages put together before submission. In order to submit a grant, I have to have the president of the college's signature, which I had no idea when I first started. I'm like, what? The president's not going to care. He cares. So it's really important that you connect with an institution or a department like that within your institution. But also starting the process, I personally think, before even reaching out to them, because you are the subject matter expert. This is archives is a bit niche. And so when you get into working with professional grant writers, it is their job to see that you succeed in this grant endeavor. But they are not archivists. They are not in the profession, and they are not working with the materials like you are. They're not trying to preserve materials like you are. So you really want to put out there what you can as a subject matter expert before they start helping you develop the narrative, and before grants accounting starts looking at your budget. But you want these people in your corner while you're writing the grant. But I personally think it's important for you to really get your professional opinion and experience and ideas on paper, and they're probably really going to appreciate that. I know my grants development team does, because they work with all different departments at the college. They're hardly ever, though, working with anything related to archives outside of what I'm doing. And there are certain people in the department that have worked with grants similar to what I'm writing before, but as it relates to being at the college, not so much. So I think it's really important that you kind of get a head start on that, even using last year's RFP, if that's made available. And you, of course, want to send it to them well in advance of the grant, the date that it actually has to be submitted to the granting organization. You want to give them plenty of time. But again, you're the subject matter expert. And I think it's also important that you write like you are explaining your project to someone outside of your field, because when it comes to grants development and grants accounting, or whatever department in your organization is going to assist you, they are outside of your field. And you don't know, if you're writing the grant for, let's say, Ohio Humanities, or a local foundation. We have the Dayton Foundation where I'm at. They might not know much about what archivists do. So even if you're writing a grant for ORAB and OLA, they know what you do, but you want to make it very clear of what you want for just everybody that's going to be reviewing and assisting you along this journey. Gather photographs to help make your case throughout. This is really important. It's great for before and after to include in your reports, whether it be an interim report, your final report. You want to include photos of pre-processed materials, if that's the type of grant you're going for, in your initial proposal. And maybe I'm overthinking it, but I think it helps tug on the heartstrings of the grantor when they see a box of materials like this, or scrapbooks that are still wrapped in twill tape because they're falling apart. And I should have put a picture of one of those scrapbooks opened and all of the flaking acidic pages and the tape and all of that. That, especially if the granting organization is archives focused, they're going to know immediately when they see those photographs exactly what you need. And of course, you're going to be explaining that through text as well. But the photos are really going to aid, I think, in kind of helping the grant reviewer understand exactly why you need this money. Establish contact. Many granting organizations will assign a person or committee to contact for questions. It's really, really important that you communicate with them for any questions you have that come up, whether it's if your project truly qualifies, if you need a review. Most funders will encourage applicants to send drafts in for review, and their comments might be very limited because there's certain things that they aren't going to be able to, certain advice that they're not going to be able to give you because they are reviewing other people's applications as well. But I think it's really important to continue that communication, ask questions. They want to help you. They want to give money to you. So just making sure to continue that communication with them. And like my first experience, we didn't even think to submit a draft for review. And had we done that, we would have gotten the feedback we needed right then and there to make the changes to get the money for that year's symposium instead of having to wait till the next year. And it's usually, they make it pretty obvious too if they're willing to accept drafts for review. For whatever reason they can't, that will likely be included on the RFP or on their website or whatever. find colleagues outside of grants development or whatever department in your institution helps with granting. Find them colleagues to help you revise, edit, or manage your budget. I am part of the library at Sinclair, so I have the librarians who are usually pretty good at reading through things. Many of them have an English degree. They're going to be able to spot check my grammar, all of that. I send my budget to accounting, or even purchasing might be able to help because they might have some preferred suppliers for the materials that you're, like, for example, the camera that we got for the most recent grant, they have a preferred supplier for that. That is actually a little bit less expensive than buying it directly from the manufacturer's website. So really think of people within your organization that can look at your narrative or your budget with a fresh eye and coming from a different perspective than you or any professionals in the field. Yeah, I think it's good, for those that know exactly what you do to look at it. So maybe, you email it to me and I'm like, oh yeah, I'll look over this because I've written a grant with this organization before, or we do the exact same thing at our institutions. Or, people in accounting or people in another office at your organization that have no idea. Hopefully they know what you do, they know who you are, but they might not know the ins and outs of, what you do on a daily basis. Get their fresh perspective on your writing and how it might come across to a reviewer. So here's a sample of the ORAB grant from 2022 to 2023. Just a few things I wanted to point out. Making your language succinct and easy to read as possible. Because like this grant, I want to say the ORAB grant usually is about 7 pages. I think both of ours are around 7 pages. And if you've done an ORAB grant before, like some of the sections will say, this section can only be 3 pages long or 5 pages long. So making sure you're within those parameters. But also, I think what helps to stay within page count and really make the information stand out and make it very legible is using tables and bulleted lists to really just pinpoint exactly what you're trying to say. There's appropriate places, when you're writing a paragraph about the history of your institution, describing your project. When it comes to project staff or a calendar, your timeline for your project, it might be easier to interpret that information through a table, a timeline, or through just a bulleted list to really get your point across, not being too wordy and thinking everything needs to be this just elaborate essay. And then also, I mentioned before, incorporating photographs to really show the condition of what project you're trying to work on, whether that's a collections project or something else. And, really like opening the boxes and taking pictures of things that like if you're applying, like say this is for an ORAB grant, I know the reviewers, when they see like those unprocessed file boxes, they're going to go, oh no, like we need to do something about that because it's clearly in terrible condition. And I was asking for supplies to process these materials. And when we were able to process them, we could take a picture and include that in our final report. Like, here's what the before were that you saw in our proposal. And now look at what we've been able to do thanks to your generosity in choosing us to receive this funding. So I'm going through just a few additional tips. Again, this is just, from my experience. And I say go big, and I don't mean go for like the $1 million grant your first time. That probably won't work out. The first grant I went for was $2,000 and I failed miserably. So I wouldn't go too big, but I think it's more so go for everything you need for that project, being reasonable. Maybe you could make it into $1 million project, but the first stage of that project, you need $3,000. And everything that you would need, for example, the current grant, which I think actually is the example I have up here. We got a camera, a really, really nice camera that's going to be able to help us digitize very large format materials, camera stand, this beautiful backdrop with lighting. It's going to be great. They didn't fund the table, and that's okay. We asked for the table because we're like, it would be really nice to have a standalone table for all of this so that we don't have to use tables we currently have that we're using on other projects. And if I'm an ORAB reviewer, I'm just hypothesizing and breaking down our grant, they're thinking, okay, they asked for all of this. They could probably do without the table, and we could use that extra money to give to somebody else to help fund an essential component of their project. We're able to fund the essential parts. They're going to give the camera stand with the camera so we can actually successfully digitize things. But the table probably isn't necessary. But we went ahead and asked for the table anyway. And that was cut out, but we still got the grant. And maybe, I can ask, especially since we're coming to the end of the fiscal year, I can ask my supervisor, like, hey, we got almost everything except this table. This really nice table that would help us out a lot. Maybe we can use some extra money from the end of the year to purchase this table. This gives you could give you a little bit of leverage if you work at an organization that might have a bit of a surplus at the end of the fiscal year. Some institutions are not, they're not in that situation, and you might not be able to ask for anything. That's fine. That's why you're probably writing a grant in the first place. I know that in my organization, it'd be hard to, ask for $2,700 for a camera. They'd be like, why do you need such a fancy camera? But if I ask, like, we got this fancy camera set up and we don't have a designated table for it, it's $600. I'm like, oh, we have that. That's fine. So it could give you a little bit of leverage there. But by go big, I mean, really think about everything you would need for that small project and just go with it. Make a case for it in your narrative. Make sure it lines up with your budget, and be okay when, okay, we didn't get the table, but that doesn't take away from this excellent grant opportunity we were just gifted. Tip 2, hiring students and welcome volunteers. This should be like tip number 1, exclamation point, because this was the biggest thing for me. I work in the library. We have a fantastic budget for student staff. I don't have a fantastic archives budget for materials and equipment and all of that, but I can hire students. Now I work at a community college, so we don't have Bachelor of History students or Masters in Public History students that they want to do this for a living eventually. But we do have computer science students that would be happy to help me digitize and navigate software that I'm unfamiliar with. We do have Associate of History students that aren't quite sure what they want to do, but they love the idea of immersing themselves in an archive opportunity. I hired a high school student as part of a summer program that the college hosted local high school students to get some experience working in just a new environment. She's wanted to go to med school, but she loved the idea of immersing herself in a different type of opportunity. And she was able to process scrapbooks and take pictures with the overhead scanner of scrapbooks. So I didn't let them, for this project in particular, this was our first ORAB grant. We had some lantern slides to digitize. They would have been a nervous wreck if I handed them a box of delicate lantern slides from 1898. I would never do that to them. And I wouldn't do that to the collection because I know as the professional, I probably am the one that should handle those things. So I did that part of the project, but I really let students and volunteers engage themselves in these projects. And I made sure to provide appropriate training, or what at least I was hoping was appropriate training, and encourage them to always ask questions. But I don't think you should limit the help of people from, I guess, outside our community directly, or students that might not, who knows if they actually want to be archivists. But if they're willing to help and listen and, work within your grant parameters, please invite them in. They're fantastic for helping you meet the cash match of any grant. Most of the grants I've applied for, it's a 1-to-1 match. And we usually far exceed the grant that we're awarded. in our match because the students are able to work a little bit more, and Sinclair pays them pretty well. So we're able to meet those matches. That's pretty much the only way I'm able to match grants is through my students and volunteers. My third tip, keeping track of all the details. Super important. Everything you digitize, process, hours worked, all of that, Excel is your friend, especially if you don't like to add up everything, it'll do it for you. I keep everything documented in a spreadsheet for every grant. Sometimes and as a records manager, I'm like, am I creating too much information? Like, I don't want to save a bunch of stuff on my shared drives that doesn't need to be there. But it's really important to capture all of this information because the granting organization is likely going to want this in your final report. So get everything, and you can provide a nice summary, or if maybe they want the full spread of it all, you'll have it available come time to write that final report. You'll be glad you kept all of this information along the way. Tip 4, I probably shouldn't have put copy. Be inspired. Use other successful grant applications and reports to inspire you to get started. Simply Googling grants related, like archive grants, or maybe there's a very specific like collections, digitization, whatever grant application, or just samples of that, you can find something. ORAB has interim and final reports published to their website. Now, this isn't the proposals, the initial applications, things like that, but you can kind of extrapolate from those final reports and interim reports how they got the grant project started and the language they use, how they built up their reporting, and the information that they chose to really showcase and make sure it was very clear through their reporting. And I think you can also reach out to a colleague that has applied for the grant before, or if you really like somebody's final or interim report, you can reach out to that organization. I know if you reached out to me and said, hey, I saw your final report on there. We're doing a similar project. Could you share your application? I would do it in a heartbeat. Now, I wouldn't be offended, I guess, if you copied it directly, but I think the ORAB team would be like, well, where have we seen this before? Because they're reviewing grants annually. So they would likely catch that. And you also want to really, again, make everything very specific to your grant opportunity and your project. But I don't think you should be afraid of being inspired by what's already out there. That's going to help save you time and brain power and all of that, because this sometimes can be a hair-pulling experience trying to get everything ready for somebody to review your work, and looking out there to see what's already been done related to, or that is kind of related to what you're wanting to do, can be really helpful and ease the stress of a process that can sometimes be pretty stressful. And my last tip is keeping unsuccessful grant proposals at least 1 year. Maybe that's the records manager in me. You want to keep it for a year and then, move forward with destruction if you so choose. But if it doesn't work that year, then revise it for the next year, or revise it for an opportunity later this year, using what you've done to, refine and make it better for the next time. I think it keeps you encouraged, and just about every granting organization is going to provide very constructive, helpful criticism of an unsuccessful grant proposal. And they do that because they want you to reapply, or they want you to seek out funding elsewhere. When I initially asked ORAB about newspapers, I believe it was Virginia Dressler that emailed me back and said, we can't fund this, but here's a bunch of organizations that can. Like, that is wonderful. If luckily I have like 1 million projects that ORAB can fund. So we just shifted what we're gonna process for this project, and we'll do student newspapers later. But if that's the only thing I was focused on right now, I could have shifted to another grant and used what I had already started to write for that. And, if I hadn't reached out to them and they said, oh, you can't do this because, we don't do newspapers for this project, but here are the other ones, then you can use that unsuccessful proposal to become a successful proposal. That is everything that I have. And again, I know like everything I talked about, I feel like was already talked about yesterday and is going to be talked about later today. This is just my experience thus far, but I'm happy to take any questions or comments that you have. Yes.
Have you had the experience of being rejected during one grant cycle and then receiving the grant whenever you reapply? And do you have any tips for that?
Sure. I was asked if I've ever been rejected in a grant cycle and then reapplied and received the grant, and if I have any tips for reapplication. My very first grant in grad school, that was the one time that I was denied, and it was pretty intense. It was knife to the gut because it was the criticism. They were pretty clear, this was not good. But it was good enough we had a whole nother year to think about how we were going to redo it. And I think that's my biggest tip is really, even if the criticism is just criticism and it's not, it will be constructive because these organizations want to give you the money. But even if for you, it doesn't come off as constructive because you wanted it, you thought you did great, and they are like, no, this is not great. And that hurts. Maybe take a week or so to be like, oh, this sucks. But I think it's important to pull yourself back up, look at what you did and what they've said. Because I highly doubt there's a granting organization that's going to send back an unsuccessful proposal and just say, this is bad. They're going to say, this is what you need to work on to be successful next time. So I think, in that experience, we did more research, thought about how we could more clearly communicate what we wanted. We made sure that our narrative and everything listed in our narrative that we wanted was clearly transferred over to the budgeting sheet. Because a lot of granting organizations, you'll have your narrative that you submit, but then also maybe an Excel spreadsheet that they pre-populate with sections on how they want you to organize what you need, making sure that there's clear interpretation between the two. But I think it's just going back to when you're reading through your revised grant application, going back to their comments and critiques and okay, we clearly established what they were asking for now, and making sure you don't miss any element of what they were critiquing you on, and making sure you're revising that and then reading it until you can't read anymore and sending it to other people to help you revise it and read through it all. I think that's my biggest tip for if you're unsuccessful, is just really taking away the critiques that were provided and doing your best with what you were provided, and taking the time to look at other granting applications too. I didn't do it in that experience, but I think if I were to be rejected, I would of course take their critiques, but also look to see if they have a list of last year's granting organizations, or even this year's granting organizations, and reach out to them and say, hey, I didn't get that grant from this organization this year. Could you share either your proposal, or maybe you ask for elements of their proposal, like how they interpreted this part of the RFP. That might be a little bit less oh, I'm not going to just send you my work. I don't know. I feel like most people in the field will be like, oh, please, yeah, take it. But that could be really helpful in achieving, really getting that grant the next time. You're welcome. Yes.
So I thought it was really interesting. Like how you described yourself, I'm very much a novice when it comes to grant writing. And I thought it was interesting that you talked about working with a student who you had to take the lead and was successful. And some of my anxiety, I'm so afraid to share something like that with anyone, way like that. So I'm just wondering if you could speak more to that, like how you make that decision and what made it such a successful experience for yourself and students and successful brand.
Yeah, thanks for asking. Matt asked about the student that I had or allowed or was okay with writing a grant during her internship opportunity with me. She was an intern from Wright State's Public History program, which I host at least one graduate intern every year at Sinclair. And then I have usually 1 to 2 student employees that are students at Sinclair also working there. And we were kind of thinking about what projects she would want to do. Because I like to have a list for my graduate students because I want to make sure that they're able to fulfill their internship and or capstone requirements successfully. And one thing I was thinking, like, man, I got a lot of benefit from writing my first grant while in grad school. It was such a wonderful learning experience. So I just added that to the list of options, like, grant writing experience. And she, for one, is a fantastic writer. I think most grad students, especially if they have an undergrad in history and they're getting their master's in history, you kind of have to be a decent writer to get that far. She just really liked the idea of writing. She also wrote my like a revised student processing manual. She just really, really wonderful writer. So I didn't have any issue with letting her take the lead on that. But if a student that maybe I wasn't quite sure on their writing style, or if this would be a project that was appropriate for them, but they wanted the experience, I would just make sure that I have the time to devote at least, 50% of my time looking over the grant and helping them write it. And she, I helped her write it. Every time she would write a part of the narrative, she would send it to me. I'd review it. She was a better writer than me, so I didn't have a whole lot to say other than great work. But if maybe, there were grammatical errors or she wasn't conveying what she needed to, say from the RFP, I put a comment that said, let's think about this a little differently. And, I told her, even if we don't get the grant, this is still a wonderful experience for you to put either on, a resume or write about in your internship and capstone project report. Because I have a million projects that I could do. Of course, I want the grant funding, but if we don't get it in the beginning and in the end, this was all for her experience. This was her final kind of hurrah before graduating. And even if maybe we submitted it, and with having a grants development team, at our college, I feel like anything I would have missed that maybe if she wasn't really hitting all the points of the RFP within the narrative, they would have caught it. But yeah, I just think that even if this would have been a total failure, it still would have been a wonderful experience for her and for me, because then I would have known next time, she would have written out the draft for the next time we would have applied for that grant. So I think it's, you have to put some trust into your students. But if they say, I want to write a grant, and that they are well equipped to do so, then I say, go for it. And if you're not quite sure, then just know that you're probably going to have to use a little bit more of your time. But if you have the time to do it, it's such a worthwhile experience. And she's, off working somewhere else now. But, she knows that she was able to contribute to an office, an organization that was pivotal in getting her to the next step. So I'm sorry, that was really rambly. But I think it's just really allowing your students to, if they are interested in understanding how to write a grant and they want that experience, to just letting it happen and I guess another component to that is, letting students work on grant projects with you and letting them really be hands-on with materials. I think that's important too. Like I said, not letting them mess with the lantern slides from 1898, but when it comes to deconstructing a scrapbook or, processing a box of haphazard, just crazy papers, it's really letting them explore the profession through your project. I think it can be really helpful. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you everybody for listening to me go on. And if you have any questions moving forward, my email and phone number are there, and I'm part of SOA too. So you're welcome to reach out anytime.